There is a moment in history that almost no one talks about. A moment so desperate, so raw, and so human that it cuts through every political argument, every textbook summary, every sanitized version of World War II that you've ever heard. It happened in April of 1943, in a city that had already been broken, starved, and stripped of everything. And it started with a radio signal, not a dramatic broadcast, not a coded military transmission from a bunker full of generals. It was something far more fragile than that. It was contact. Real, crackling, barely audible contact between people who were dying inside the Warsaw Ghetto and the people outside its walls who were supposed to be helping them. And what was said in those transmissions, what the survivors managed to speak into a microphone before everything collapsed, has been sitting in archives, in testimonies, in the gaps between official histories for decades. If you've never heard what actually came through those radio channels, you need to, because it changes everything you think you know about the uprising, about the Polish underground, about what it means to fight when no one is coming to save you. Stay with me. This is going to take a while, and every second of it matters. Before we get to the radios, you need to understand the silence that came before them. Because the silence is the whole point. Without understanding just how completely the Warsaw Ghetto had been cut off from the rest of the world, the weight of what those survivors finally said cannot fully land. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in November of 1940. The Germans ordered more than 400,000 Jewish people crammed into an area of roughly 3.5 square kilometers, surrounded by a wall nearly 3 meters high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire. People lived 10, 12, 15 to a room. Typhus spread through the buildings like smoke. Food rations were designed not to sustain life, but to end it slowly. By 1941, people were dying of starvation in the streets, at a rate of thousands per month. Bodies were left on the pavements because families could not afford a burial. Children begged at the base of the wall, pushing their arms through holes in the brick, hoping someone on the Aryan side would press food into their hands. And the wall was not just a physical structure, it was a communications blackout. Mail was monitored and censored. Movement was forbidden under penalty of death. Any Polish person caught helping a Jew on the other side of the wall could be executed, along with their entire family. That was not a rumor. That was stated German policy, and it was enforced. The Poles who did try to help did so knowing exactly what could happen to them. And still, some tried. But for a long time, the channels between the two worlds were primitive. Notes smuggled through sewer grates, whispered conversations at wall checkpoints, money passed through gaps, weapons brought through tunnels in pieces and reassembled in cellars. What was almost entirely absent, for most of the ghetto's existence, was a real, functional, two-way radio connection. And without that connection, the people inside were shouting into a void. They could hear fragments of what was happening in the outside world through clandestine radios. They knew the war was ongoing. They knew Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. They heard pieces of BBC broadcasts. But communicating back, actually transmitting information outward, actually making contact with the Polish underground and saying we are here, we are dying, we are asking for help, that was enormously difficult. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, was a massive and sophisticated underground military organization. At its peak, it had hundreds of thousands of members. It had its own intelligence networks, its own weapons manufacturing operations, its own courier routes, and its own radio communications infrastructure that connected to the Polish government in exile based in London. The Home Army was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most formidable resistance movements in occupied Europe. But the Home Army was also a reflection of the society it came from, and Polish society in 1943 was complicated. Within the Home Army's leadership, attitudes toward the Jewish population of Poland ranged across a wide spectrum. Some commanders were genuinely committed to helping. Some were indifferent. Some were hostile. And the institutional relationship between the Home Army and the Jewish fighting organization inside the ghetto, known by its Polish acronym ZOB, was never what it should have been. The ZOB had been sending requests for weapons, ammunition, and assistance for months before the uprising. The Home Army provided some help. Pistols, a small amount of explosives, training for a handful of fighters, but it was never enough, not even close to enough. And the people inside the ghetto knew it. Mordecai Anielewicz, the 24-year-old commander of the ZOB, understood what they were facing. He understood it with the kind of clarity that only comes when you have already watched an entire civilization be erased around you. By early 1943, the Great Deportation of the previous summer had already removed over 250,000 people from the ghetto and sent them to the Treblinka extermination camp. Everyone who remained knew what the cattle cars meant. There were no more illusions about resettlement or labor camps. The word Treblinka meant one thing, and Anielewicz and his fighters made a decision that was not about survival. It was about something else entirely. They decided to fight. Not because they thought they could win, not because they believed the cavalry was coming. They decided to fight because the alternative was to walk onto the trains again, and they were done walking onto trains. The uprising began on April 19, 1943. It was the eve of Passover. It was also the day the SS and German police moved into the ghetto to complete what they called the final liquidation, the deportation or killing of the remaining roughly 50,000 to 70,000 people still living there. What they expected was compliance. What they got was gunfire. The fighters of the ZOB, numbering somewhere around 500 to 700 people, equipped with a handful of pistols, a small number of rifles, homemade grenades, and Molotov cocktails, opened fire on the German columns entering the ghetto. The Germans, caught completely off guard, fell back. On the first day of the uprising, the SS and police were driven out of the ghetto. For a few hours on April 19, 1943, a few hundred Jewish fighters in a burning city stopped the German military machine in its tracks. The news spread immediately. Inside the ghetto, it spread by messenger and by shouting through walls. Outside the ghetto, it spread through underground channels. And somewhere in that chaos, in those first burning days, the question of radio communication became desperately urgent. Now, here is where I need to be very precise about what the radio situation actually was, because there are competing accounts and oversimplifications in a lot of popular histories. There was no single clean radio moment where the ZOB broadcast to the Home Army and everything changed. What actually happened was more complicated, more painful, and more revealing than that. The ZOB had access to a clandestine radio transmitter. It was not a powerful military-grade device. It was a small, improvised piece of equipment that had been assembled with enormous difficulty. Operating it was dangerous because the Germans had direction-finding equipment that could triangulate a radio signal and locate the transmitter. Every time you transmitted, you risked leading the SS directly to your position. And in the context of a military operation where every building was being searched and burned, that risk was almost impossible to calculate. The Home Army, for its part, had functioning radio communications with London and with its own command structures. Its radio operators were trained professionals who understood military communications protocol. They were also operating in a city where German surveillance was intense and where a single mistake could collapse an entire network. Contact between the two sides during the uprising was sporadic, partial, and filtered through multiple layers. Some of it came through the ZOB's own transmitter. Some of it came through intermediaries who carried written messages. Some of it came through the Polish Socialist Party's own underground networks, which maintained closer relationships with the Jewish resistance than the Home Army's leadership did. And some of it came through Zagoda, the Polish Council to Aid Jews, which was functioning as a lifeline for Jews hiding on the Aryan side. But there were moments, real moments, when voices from inside the ghetto came through, when people who were fighting and burning and dying managed to speak. And what they said, recorded in Home Army reports, in survivor testimonies, in the memoirs of radio operators, in the accounts later gathered by historians, is what this is all about. One of the first and most significant communications that came through in the early days of the uprising was stark in its directness. The fighters inside were not delivering grand speeches. They were not making political proclamations. They were reporting military realities. The Germans had entered with tanks and flamethrowers. The buildings were being systematically burned. The ZOB had held certain positions. They needed ammunition. They needed ammunition desperately. The weapons they had were already running low. They were asking, directly and without ceremony, for resupply. The Home Army received these communications, and the response, the actual documented response to those requests, became one of the most contested and painful chapters in Polish-Jewish historical relations. Some Home Army commanders authorized operations to help. There were genuine, courageous efforts to pass ammunition through the sewers, to create diversionary attacks on German positions near the ghetto walls, to smuggle fighters in. A Home Army unit attempted an attack on German positions near the ghetto on April 19th. The effort was beaten back with casualties. There were other attempts. Real people risked their lives on those operations and some died. But it was not enough. The ZOB fighters knew it was not enough, and the radio communications reflect that gap between what was asked and what arrived. Leon Rodal, one of the ZOB commanders, reportedly transmitted a message in those early days that was anguished in its simplicity. He was describing what the fighters could see from their positions. The ghetto was on fire. Block after block was burning. The Germans were not fighting building to building the way soldiers fight. They were burning. They were flooding the bunkers with smoke and gas. They were cutting off escape routes and waiting. And the fighters were holding their positions with weapons that were nearly exhausted. What Rodal and others communicated through whatever channels were available was not a request for negotiation or for diplomatic intervention. They were not asking the Home Army to appeal to the Germans or to make some political gesture. They were asking for guns, for grenades, for the means to continue a fight that they knew could not be won, but that they had decided must be fought. And the fact that those requests were received, processed, discussed in Home Army command meetings, and ultimately only partially and inadequately answered is a historical fact that serious historians on both sides have now acknowledged. But let me tell you something about the radio communications that tends to get lost in the political debate. It is this. The people transmitting from inside the ghetto were not simply soldiers filing reports. They were human beings who had been living in conditions of unimaginable suffering for years. And when they finally had a microphone, when they finally had a line that might, even briefly, connect them to someone outside, what came through was not only tactical information. What came through was witness. Zivia Lubetkin was one of the most extraordinary people to emerge from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She was one of the founders of the ZOB. She was a leader, a fighter, a person of almost supernatural endurance. She survived the uprising by escaping through the sewers. She later emigrated to what would become Israel. And in the years after the war, she testified at length about what happened inside the ghetto, including about what the fighters communicated and what they tried to communicate during those weeks. What she described was a desperate attempt not just to call for help, but to make the outside world understand what was actually happening. Because one of the most devastating experiences of the ghetto was not just the violence, it was the disbelief. When the first reports of mass murder had come out of Treblinka and other camps, many people, inside the ghetto and outside it, had found the information simply too enormous to accept. The idea that an entire civilization of people was being methodically destroyed in purpose-built killing facilities was something that the human mind resisted. Even inside the ghetto, even among people who knew the truth intellectually, there was a part of the brain that kept searching for another explanation. The ZOB fighters had no more room for doubt. They had seen what they had seen. They had lost brothers, sisters, parents, entire networks of people they had known since childhood. And when they got on a radio, when they managed to transmit, part of what they were transmitting was not just military data. It was testimony. This is real. This is happening. Tell the world that this is happening. Marek Edelman, who was one of the ZOB's deputy commanders and who became after the war one of the most important voices of the uprising, spoke about this in interviews conducted decades later. He talked about what it felt like to transmit messages knowing that they might reach London, might reach the Polish government in exile, might reach the BBC. The frustration was not just that help wasn't coming fast enough. The frustration was that the information itself seemed to disappear into a silence that the outside world maintained around the fact of extermination. There is a famous message that was composed during the uprising, a message that was sent through multiple channels, including radio transmissions, addressed to the Polish government in exile and to the world more broadly. It came from Shmuel Zygielboim, a Jewish member of the Polish National Council in London, who had been receiving information about the uprising. He himself was not in Warsaw, he was in London, but he was in communication with what was happening. And when he understood the scale of what was occurring, and when he understood that the world's response was not commensurate with the emergency, he made a decision that I want to come back to, because it is one of the most haunting moments in this entire story. But first, let me tell you about what the survivors who survived long enough to transmit said in those middle weeks. Because April became May, and the ghetto was still burning. The Germans had expected the uprising to be crushed in 3 days. SS General Jürgen Stroop, who commanded the German forces conducting the liquidation, had told his superiors it would be quick. It was not quick. It lasted 27 days of organized resistance, and even after that, Individual fighters hiding in bunkers continued to hold out for weeks. The ghetto burned almost completely. Building after building was set on fire systematically. The smoke was visible from across Warsaw. Polish residents on the other side of the wall could see the flames and the columns of smoke and smell the burning. And through it all, the radio communications continued. Fragmentary, intermittent, but continuing. What the fighters communicated in those middle weeks was a combination of tactical reports and something that sounds, when you read it now, almost like dictation, like people who knew they might not survive and were determined to leave a record. They described the bunkers, the ZAB and other resistance groups, as well as tens of thousands of civilians, had built an extraordinary network of underground bunkers beneath the ghetto. Some were simple cellars, some were elaborate, with ventilation systems, water supplies, multiple exit routes, electricity powered by car batteries. The bunker at Mila 18 was one of the most important, serving as the ZOB's Central Command headquarters. The transmissions described conditions in the bunkers. People had been underground for weeks. Air was running short. Water was running short. Children were crying and had to be held, comforted, kept quiet, because any sound could lead the Germans to a hiding place. The wounded were lying on makeshift beds without adequate medical supplies. People were dying not from bullets but from the conditions. And still, when the Germans came near, the fighters emerged and fought. One of the most striking elements of the surviving accounts is how consistently the fighters distinguished between two things. They distinguished between their own deaths, which they had accepted, and the deaths of the civilians sheltering in the bunkers. The fighters had made their decision. They were combatants. They understood what fighting meant and what it would cost. But the thousands of civilians who had taken shelter were a different matter. And when the transmissions talked about what help was needed, what help would have made a difference, it was partly for those people that the fighters were still asking. Water, food, medical supplies, a route out for the civilians who could not fight. These were things that, with sufficient organization and commitment, might have been moved through the sewer network. The sewers of Warsaw were a labyrinth. They had been used for smuggling before and during the uprising. A functioning escape route for civilians was not a fantasy. It was a logistical problem that, with resources and commitment, could theoretically have been addressed. Some people did escape through the sewers. After the bunker at Mila 18 fell, after Mordecai Anielewicz and dozens of other fighters died there on May 8th, a group of survivors that included Zivia Lubetkin and Marek Edelman made it out through the sewers, with the help of people on the outside. It was an extraordinary operation. It required coordination, it required people on the Aryan side willing to be at the right manhole cover at the right moment, and it required extraordinary physical endurance from people who had been living underground for weeks. But it worked. For some, not for most. The question of why more was not done, why the sewer escape route was not more systematically exploited, why more resources were not committed, is a question that the radio transmissions from the survivors illuminate in painful ways. Because the survivors were not vague about what they needed. They were specific. They were operationally specific. And the gap between the specificity of their requests and the adequacy of the response is documented. Now I want to talk about what happened on the outside. Because the Home Army operators who received these transmissions were not robots. They were people. And understanding what they were dealing with helps complete the picture without excusing the inadequacy of the response. The Home Army in 1943 was operating in a city under total German military occupation. Every building, every street, every face was potentially a surveillance threat. The Germans had informers everywhere. They conducted random searches. They arrested people for possession of a radio. They executed people for helping Jews. The penalty was death, and the Germans meant it. Entire families had been shot for sheltering Jewish people. The Home Army's radio networks were constantly under threat of discovery. Operators worked in short bursts, moved their equipment frequently, and lived in a state of permanent vigilance. When communications came in from the ghetto, processing those communications, verifying their accuracy, deciding on a response, authorizing operations, that all took time and organizational bandwidth. The Home Army was also fighting on multiple fronts. It was conducting sabotage operations against the German war machine. It was protecting its own people. It was managing its own internal political tensions. It was communicating with London and trying to maintain its strategic position. None of this justifies what happened, but understanding it explains why the response was what it was. The people in the Home Army who wanted to help more were not always the ones making the decisions. And the institutional bias that placed Jewish lives at a lower priority than the organization's broader strategic concerns was real and had real consequences that played out in those radio exchanges. There were individual Home Army members and officers who pushed hard to do more. The Zagota network was full of such people. Henryk Walensky, who headed the Home Army's Jewish Affairs Department, was genuinely committed to doing everything within his power to support the uprising and document what was happening. Jan Karski, who had already made legendary missions carrying eyewitness testimony about the extermination camps to the west, understood what was at stake. These individuals represent something important about the complexity of the situation. But individual commitment was not enough to overcome institutional limitations, political ambivalence at the top of the Home Army, and the sheer impossible mathematics of the situation. When the transmissions from the ghetto made it to London, when the Polish government in exile received information about the uprising, the response there was also a source of deep anguish for the survivors. Because what the survivors needed was not a diplomatic note. They needed military action. They needed the Allied powers to intervene in some concrete way. They needed German supply lines to be disrupted. They needed airdrops of weapons over the ghetto. They needed the BBC to broadcast what was happening so loudly and so consistently that it could not be ignored. Some of that happened. The BBC did broadcast information about the uprising. The Polish government in exile did make appeals. There were broadcasts from London to occupied Poland. Some of the news about what was happening in Warsaw did reach the wider world. But the scale of the response was not commensurate with what the transmissions described, and the people transmitting from inside the ghetto knew it. The fighters could hear BBC broadcasts. They had their own clandestine radio receivers. They could listen to what London was saying about the uprising, and there is testimony from survivors that describes the experience of hearing a brief BBC report about the Warsaw Ghetto and then returning to the reality of the burning buildings around them. The gap between the information being transmitted and the response that came back was experienced not as a communication failure, but as an abandonment. Marek Edelman spoke about this with extraordinary directness in his later interviews and in his collaboration with the writer Hannah Krall on the book called Shielding the Flame. He did not soften what he observed. The uprising was not a military victory. It was never going to be a military victory. The fighters knew that from the beginning. What they were trying to do was something different. They were trying to choose the manner of their deaths. They were trying to die fighting rather than in the gas chambers, and they were trying to make the world bear witness to the fact that they had fought, that they had not gone quietly, that they had said no. The radio communications were part of that witness. Every transmission was a refusal to be silent. Every crackling, fragmentary, dangerous transmission was an act of saying, "We are here, we are real, we are fighting, and we are asking you to know what is happening to us." Now let me tell you about Shmuel Ziegelboim, because his story is the radio story taken to its most devastating conclusion. Ziegelboim was a Jewish labor activist who had been a member of the Judenrat in Warsaw in the early days of the occupation, before escaping to continue the fight from the outside. He had made it to London and was serving as the representative of the Bund, the Jewish socialist movement, on the Polish National Council in exile. He had been one of the most persistent voices in London, trying to communicate what was happening to Polish Jews, to the Allied governments, and to the world. He received reports about the uprising. He received, through the channels available to him, information about what the fighters were experiencing, what they were communicating, and what the response had been. And he understood, with a completeness that was devastating, that the help that had been asked for had not come, that the world had received the testimony of people who were dying and had not responded adequately. On the night of May 11th to 12th, 1943, as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was in its final days, Shmuel Ziegelboim took his own life in his apartment in London. He left a letter. The letter is one of the most important documents of the Second World War, and it needs to be read in the context of those radio transmissions from inside the ghetto. He wrote that the responsibility for the murder of the Jewish people in Poland rested on the murderers themselves, but that the indifference of the world, the passivity of the Allied governments, the failure to act when the information was available, made those governments morally complicit. He wrote that he could not go on living when the remnants of the Jewish people in Poland, of whom he was a representative, were dying. He wrote that his death might contribute, however little, to shaking the conscience of the world. It did not shake the world. Not enough. The Warsaw Ghetto was almost completely destroyed by May 16th, when Stroop declared the operation complete by blowing up the Great Synagogue of Warsaw. The bunkers were flooded and burned. The few survivors were shot or captured or, extraordinarily, escaped through the sewers. And then there was silence on the radio channels that had, for 27 days, carried something that the world should never have allowed itself to ignore. The surviving fighters who made it out of the ghetto carried what they had transmitted in their bodies, their memories, their damaged hearing, their scars. And in the years after the war, the testimony they gave was itself a kind of continued transmission. They were still transmitting, still trying to make the contact that the radios had begun. Zivia Lubetkin testified before audiences in Israel, in front of journalists, in front of historians. She described the bunkers with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail, not for her own sake, but so that others would know. She described the moments when transmissions were made, and what was said in them, and what came back. She described the moment she understood that no substantial rescue was coming. And she described the decision to continue fighting anyway. What is remarkable about her testimony, what is remarkable about Edelman's testimony, and about the accounts gathered by historians like Yisrael Gutman and Emanuel Ringelblum, is the absence of self-pity. These were not people who presented themselves as victims. They were people who had made choices under conditions of absolute extremity and who were determined that those choices be understood. Not romanticized, not mythologized, but understood. When Edelman was asked in later interviews what the uprising meant, he resisted the heroic narrative. He said they had fought because there was nothing else left to do. He said that courage was not something they had chosen, because there was no other option available. He said that the thing he wanted people to understand was not the fighting. The fighting was simple. What he wanted people to understand was everything that came before. The years in the ghetto, the systematic starvation, the deportations, the process by which an entire community was stripped of everything human and then murdered. That was the story. The fighting was just the last chapter. And within that last chapter, the radio transmissions represent something specific and important. They represent the attempt, even at the final moment, to communicate, to connect, to make the contact that had been denied for years. When the Home Army's radio operators finally received clear transmissions from inside the ghetto, some of them were young men and women who had never expected to be carrying this kind of weight. One operator, whose account was recorded by a historian who interviewed him decades later, described sitting with headphones on in a basement somewhere in Warsaw, listening to a voice coming through the static from the other side of the wall. The voice was describing what was happening. There was noise in the background. There might have been explosions. There might have been fire, and the operator sat there and copied down what he heard, and passed it up the chain, and then went back to his equipment and waited for the next transmission. He said in his old age that he had never forgotten the voices, that you could tell, even through the distortion, that these were people. Not combatants in the abstract military sense, people, and that the experience of being the first person on the outside to receive what they said, the first person to hear it, carried a weight that he did not know what to do with when he was young, and still did not fully know what to do with decades later. That is what radio contact in a war actually is. It is not just signal and response. It is one human being reaching across an impossible distance to find another human being and say, "I am here. Can you hear me? Are you there?" The survivors could hear the crackling response. They could hear the confirmation that their signal had been received, and what that confirmation gave them was not rescue. It was witness. It was the knowledge that someone on the other side of the wall knew what was happening, that the silence had been, at least partially, broken, that they were not dying in complete darkness. I want to spend some time talking about the specific content of what was communicated, because this is something that histories often flatten into summary. The transmissions were not monolithic. They were not a single message. They were a series of communications over days and weeks, and they covered a range of things that together paint an extraordinary picture. There were military reports, positions held and lost, German forces advancing with armored vehicles, artillery, flamethrowers. Casualty figures, though these became harder to track as the fighting intensified. Requests for specific types of ammunition, for additional explosives, for medical supplies. There were intelligence reports. The fighters inside the ghetto had a clearer view of certain German positions than the Home Army did from outside. They could observe patterns of German movement. They could report on which units were being used, on the tactics the Germans were employing, on where the weak points in the German perimeter might be. There were personal messages, people asking for information about family members who had escaped to the Aryan side. People trying to verify whether certain individuals had made it out. These messages were not separate from the military communications. They were woven through them, because the people transmitting were not professional soldiers who had left their humanity at the door. They were people. And there were the broader testimonial transmissions, the attempts to communicate not just tactical information, but the larger reality of what was happening, the systematic nature of the extermination, the numbers, the conditions, the names of German officers responsible for specific atrocities, information that, if it had been acted on more aggressively, could have been used in ways that might have changed some things. Some of it was acted on. Information about German commanders was compiled. Reports were sent to London. Some of it made it into Allied intelligence files, but the gap between information received and action taken was, as always, enormous. There is a transmission that multiple sources reference, though its exact wording varies depending on who is recording it. A transmission that is sometimes attributed to Analevich himself or to someone in his headquarters, sent in the early days of the uprising, that said something that has been quoted in different forms across different histories, but whose core content is consistent. The sentiment it expressed was this: "We are fighting. We know how this ends. We are not asking you to save us. We are asking you to know what is happening here. We are asking you to tell the world what the Jewish people of Warsaw chose to do when there was nothing left to choose. Do not let this disappear." Whatever the exact words were, the meaning was clear. And the meaning reveals something profound about what those radio transmissions actually were. They were not just communications. They were a commission. A commission to the people receiving them, to the Polish Home Army, to the government in exile, to London, to the world, to carry what they were hearing, and to do something with it. Not with weapons necessarily, not in time to change what was happening, but afterward, to carry the truth. Some of the people who received those transmissions did carry it. Some of the Home Army radio operators who heard those voices went on to testify about what they had received. Some of the reports compiled from those transmissions were preserved in archives. Fragments survived, enough to reconstruct, at least partially, what was said. But there was also a long period after the war during which the full complexity of what had happened between the Polish Home Army and the Jewish fighters was not openly discussed. There were political and nationalist reasons, on both sides in various ways, for simplifying the story. For the Polish national narrative, the Home Army was a heroic resistance movement, which it genuinely was in many ways, and the nuances of its relationship with the Jewish uprising were uncomfortable. For other narratives, the uprising was sometimes presented in ways that underemphasized the role of individual Poles who had helped, or the genuine danger that those helpers faced. The historians who began doing serious work on this in the later decades of the 20th century, people like Yisrael Gutman, Barbara Engelking, Jan Grabowski, Antony Polonsky, Dariusz Libionka, found in the archives a story far more complicated and in some ways far more instructive than either simplified version. What they found was that the transmissions were real and their content was documented, that the help provided was genuine but inadequate, that individual courage often existed in the face of institutional failure, and that the survivors' own accounts of those radio contacts were among the most important documents available for understanding what actually happened. Marek Edelman, who outlived virtually everyone else who had been a leader of the ZOB, surviving until 2009, spent decades in Poland refusing to emigrate, choosing to remain in the country where everything had happened. He became a cardiologist. He saved lives in a different way, and he kept talking. He kept transmitting, in his own manner, the information that needed to be heard. He spoke to journalists, to students, to politicians, to anyone who would listen, and he never allowed the story to be made comfortable. He talked about the radios, and the contact, and the responses, or lack thereof, with the same clarity he brought to everything. He did not accuse every Polish person of indifference. He knew better than that. He had known and worked with Polish people who had risked their lives to help, but he also did not pretend that the institutional response of the Polish underground had been adequate. He held both truths simultaneously, which is the only honest way to hold them. One of the things he said, in various forms across various interviews, was that what the uprising proved was something very specific and not entirely comforting. It proved that people can fight, that human beings, even in conditions of absolute deprivation and despair, are capable of organized, sustained, meaningful resistance. But it also proved that fighting, by itself, without the support of the world, without the international community choosing to act on the information it has been given, is not enough to change the outcome. The fighters chose how they died. The world's indifference chose whether anyone else had to die with them. The radio transmissions are, in that framework, the hinge point. They are the moment when the information left the ghetto and entered the outside world. They are the moment when the testimony was made and the commission was given, and they are the measure of what was done with what was received. Now, I want to talk about some of the specific people whose voices were part of those transmissions and whose stories are carried in what survived of the radio contacts, because the human scale of this is important. The uprising was not an abstraction. It was a collection of individual human beings making decisions. There was Tosha Altman, one of the ZOB's key couriers and organizers, a young woman who had carried messages and weapons through impossible conditions in the months before the uprising, and who fought inside the ghetto during it. She was responsible, in part, for communications networks that connected the ZOB to contacts outside the wall. She was injured during the uprising and died of her wounds in May of 1943. The communications she helped establish and maintain were part of how contact was made. There was Yitzhak Zuckerman, known as Antec, who was one of the ZOB's founders, and who was, by the beginning of the uprising, on the Aryan side of the wall trying to coordinate outside support. He was in direct contact with Home Army representatives. He was at meetings where the question of additional weapons and support was discussed. He later described those meetings in his memoir, A Surplus of Memory, one of the most important first-person accounts of the entire period, with a clarity about what was offered and what was refused, and what the consequences were. Zuckerman's account of his interactions with Home Army representatives during the uprising is remarkable in its precision. He was not someone who generalized or exaggerated. He named people. He described specific conversations. He described what was promised and what arrived. And what he describes is a pattern of genuine goodwill from certain individuals combined with institutional limitations and in some cases political unwillingness that resulted in the fighters inside the ghetto receiving a fraction of what they needed. He also described the experience of receiving word that a transmission had come through, of getting information from inside the ghetto via the radio channels and then immediately having to decide what to do with it, what action to take, which contacts to approach, how to move the information up to people who might be able to respond. The information moved through layers, and at each layer something was lost or delayed or diminished. And Zuckerman sat on the Aryan side, knowing what was happening 50 meters away on the other side of the wall, and worked every connection he had to try to get more help in. His testimony about the radio contacts is testimony about the unbearable experience of being the person who receives the message and cannot fully deliver the response that the message deserves. There is another dimension to this that I think deserves serious attention, and that is the question of what the transmissions meant for the people who made them, not what they produced in terms of outside action, what they meant for the fighters themselves. There is something in the human experience about being heard that is distinct from being helped. We know from psychology, from philosophy, from every human tradition, that testimony matters, that the act of bearing witness, of speaking and being received, of making contact, has a value that is not reducible to whether it produces material change. The fighters inside the Warsaw Ghetto were dying. They knew they were dying. They had made their peace with that. What they had not made their peace with was the possibility of dying in total silence, of everything they had lived and fought and endured simply disappearing without record. The radio transmissions were their refusal of that silence. Every time a fighter or a commander or a radio operator in the ghetto keyed a transmitter and sent a signal out, they were saying, "I am real, this is real, this happened." And when a signal came back, when the confirmation came that someone outside had received what was sent, that confirmation was not nothing. Even if no weapons followed, even if no rescue came, the confirmation that the transmission had been received was itself a form of contact that mattered. Survivors who testified about the radio communications often described the moment of contact, the moment when a response came back from outside, with an emotional intensity that is out of proportion to the tactical value of the exchange, because the tactical value was often limited, but the human value was enormous. It meant that you were not alone in the way you feared you were alone. It meant that someone outside the wall was listening. It meant that the information you were carrying would not die with you. Zivia Lubetkin, in one of her testimonies, described the fighters' awareness that history was watching, that what they were doing was not just a military operation, but an act of witness. She said that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for the generations that would come after, that would need to know that this resistance had happened. And the radio, in that context, was not just a military tool. It was a connection to those future generations, a way of transmitting the testimony across time. That is an extraordinary thing to carry in your mind while buildings burn around you. And yet that is what the testimony of survivors describes. A simultaneous awareness of the immediate military reality, the tactical moment-to-moment of the fighting, and a larger sense of historical responsibility, of obligation to the future. Edelman described this with characteristic directness. He said that the fighters understood they were making history. Not in the sense of winning, in the sense of choosing what the record would say. And the radio was one of the ways they tried to ensure the record would say what they needed it to say. The record did survive, imperfectly, fragmentarily, but it survived. The reports compiled by the Home Army from radio transmissions are in archives. The testimonies of survivors are published and available. The research of historians has assembled from scattered fragments a picture of what was communicated, and when, and by whom, and what the response was. And now, many decades later, that record is available to anyone who chooses to look at it. Anyone who chooses to actually sit with the testimony rather than the summary. Anyone who is willing to hear what was said through those crackling radio channels in